Right. Hello, everyone. We are in for the final video of the month of January. And as usual, we are doing our president's video for the month. So we are going to go ahead and do get along with that. So for the last president's video that we had done, we had covered Warren G. Harding, who was our 29th president. I don't know why I'm thinking of the year he died. 29th president. He was the last one to have come from my state of Ohio. He kind of left office on not the greatest of notes. He ended up dying in office, as we may recall. But right about the time that he died, there was a bunch of scandals that were coming to light that were occurring within his administration. So, of course, as we know, when the president dies in office, their successor is the vice president. So, the next in line to the presidency was Harding's vice president, Mr. Coolidge. Mr. Calvin Coolidge was vice president under President Harding, and he is now thrust into the office of the president as now the 30th president of the United States. Who it's kind of odd thinking that he was president only 100 years ago. So we will go along with that today. So we will go through the usual run, go through a little bit of history of his life before he gotten up to this point, and then we'll go through how he got there, of course, and then his accomplishments and maybe not so good accomplishments during his presidency, and then post presidency if he really had one. With Coolidge, he didn't really get to have a very long post presidency, like at all. He kind of had a relatively short one. So for Calvin Coolidge, he is born John Calvin Coolidge. He preferred to go by his middle name more than his first because him and his dad actually had the same name. But he was born John Calvin Coolidge in Plymouth Notch, Vermont on July 4th of 1872. Now, mind you, we know that there are three presidents who died on the 4th of July. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on July 4th of 1826. And then James Monroe, our fifth president, would also die on July 4th of 1831. But Coolidge is the only president to have been born on the 4th of July. He was born on the 4th. His father was John Calvin Coolidge. His father was a frugal businessman who ran both a general store and a local post office in Plymouth Notch. His mother, Victoria Moore, died when Calvin was only 12 years old. So Calvin didn't really get to know his mother all that well, at least he didn't get to have her as a lasting influence in his life in many respects. John Coolidge, his father, actually traced his American ancestry to Puritan ancestors in 1630, and Calvin Coolidge was even he was even descended from a couple of people that had been on the original Mayflower back with the Pilgrims in 1620. So he has quite of the American root, but he also has New England roots, vastly New England roots, and that is going to play a major role in his upbringing because during his youth, particularly his father sought to instill in his son Puritan values of honesty, piety, thrift, and industry within Calvin, while he also picked up at least his love of reading and his love of nature from his mother. Now, Calvin would graduate from Black River Academy School in Ludlow, Vermont in the year 1890. He would then go on to attend Amherst College in Massachusetts, where he would graduate with honors in 1895. After Amherst, Calvin would attend and study law at at a local law school, and then he would end up being admitted to the Massachusetts State Bar in 1898. He would end up shortly afterward opening his own law office in the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, where he would deal with cases dealing in subjects of real estate deals, wills, and bankruptcies. He wasn't so much a criminal lawyer. He would end up marrying shortly within the next 10 years. He would end up meeting the love of his life. He would end up meeting Grace Anna Goodhue. She was a teacher at a local school for the deaf, and they fell in love. And on October 4th of 1905, they ended up getting married. The couple would end up having two sons together. They would have John, who would also be sharing his father in his dad's name, who was born in 1906 and would actually not die until the year 2000. And they would also have another son, Calvin Coolidge Jr., who was born in 1908, but he tragically passed away during his father's presidency due to getting blood poisoning from a blister on his foot, and it impacted his father quite severely at the time, just as the death of any child would, probably a grieving father, no matter what their position or job. And we'll come back to that as we get into his presidency. That is an event that happens that year that does shape a little bit of his attitude. So, going into Calvin Coolidge's political career, he has a really rapid start in politics. He's not, mind you, we're already in 1905 and he's gotten married. And we know that in 1923 he's going to become president, but that he had been vice president since 1921. So he has a very rapid rise through politics, Coolidge does. He begins his political career in 1898 when he ends up getting elected to the Northampton City Council. And that is a post that he holds for a number of years before actually being elected mayor of Northampton in 1909. Coolidge would then serve shortly after his time as being the mayor of Northampton. He would go on to serve in the Massachusetts state legislature. He would serve as a Massachusetts state senator from 1911 to 1915, and then he would even get elected as lieutenant governor from 1915 to 1918. So just right through the years of World War One. Coolidge would, during those years of his early political career, he made a habit of studying policy questions. He studied policy questions extensively during his early political career, and he would start making speeches across the state, more reflecting on policy things. And that was a different brand of politician, I think, to Coolidge, because most politicians at that time were not afraid to lambast the policies and stuff of their opponent. They were not afraid to call out their opponent by name and, try to make them seem ill. Coolidge was not that type of politician. He would merely debate on the issues of policy and of actual political questions. He didn't like to insult his political opponents. He liked to debate the policies that they might put forward and argue why this policy that he was supporting was much better than that put forward by his opponent. But he was not in it for the mudslinging personal insults, as many politicians would be, which we'll see later. Calvin is not a man of many words. Now, Coolidge, during that time, would also start to gain influence within the Republican Party, of which he identified with during his early political career. In 1919, Coolidge would end up getting elected as the governor of the state of Massachusetts. So he ends up accelerating to the top executive within his adopted state. And that is gonna put him on a very quick rise toward going to the vice presidency. He would gain notoriety just a year into his gubernatorial term in 1919 when the Boston police strike would occur, which basically what had happened was the Boston police force ended up going on strike, and Coolidge at first wasn't really wanting to act against them, but eventually, the strike turned quite sour because there ended up being riots that started to break out and Boston started to descend into chaos. As governor, Coolidge issued an order for the state guard to restore order after the riots were breaking out, and thus took a very strong stance against the use of violence in this strike. And he was also adamant after the strike was completed against anybody in the state of Massachusetts rehiring the police officers who had actually gone out on strike and participated in these riots. A common quote that was attributed to Coolidge at the time as him saying was that there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. Basically arguing Coolidge's perspective that you have the right to strike, but you will not have the right to do it if you're going to use violence to get there. Now, Coolidge's unexpected shot to national notoriety with his breakup of the Boston police strike in 1919 made him a viable candidate when the Republican convention came up in 1920. And of course, in 1920, we all know they end up picking Warren Harding as the main candidate for president. But the question was, who would be Harding's running mate? They didn't really have an idea of who should be Harding's running mate, and Coolidge was put in the initial ballots, but he initially ranked only 6 out of the candidates that were being put in forward. He only ranked 6 out of them. After a couple of the earlier proposals had been turned down or couldn't get an agreement upon, Coolidge's name was almost put in there as a last resort, almost as, somebody that's not really, he's kind of new to the Republican Party, he's kind of new to the national scene. He's got a favorable reputation, and not really anybody at the convention could say a bad thing about Coolidge because of his recent ascent to politics, and they kinda argued maybe he'd be a good candidate because it's not like the vice president is expected to do much, and that ended up sealing the Republican convention to go for Coolidge, and they ended up nominating him to be Harding's running mate in 1920 for the 1920 election. Now, as we know, Harding in the 1920 campaign had run a front porch campaign from his Marion home. He didn't travel the country. He didn't go out on wide campaign speeches and, expensive visits. He stayed and ran a campaign right from his home in Marion, Ohio, which is something that is unheard of today, something you could not get away with today. Coolidge did not do that. Coolidge actually went out there and campaigned for the Republican ticket during that election year. Coolidge went and campaigned throughout his native New England. He went and campaigned in New York. He even took a trip down to the Upper South, a region that usually wasn't something a lot of Republicans would pay a lot of attention to because pretty much since Reconstruction had ended, Democrats always won the southern states because of Republicans' opposition at times to segregation and stuff like that. But Southerners had almost always voted Democratic after the end of Reconstruction because they associated Republicans with the party of Lincoln, the party that beat them in the Civil War, and thus had tried to implement, change their society after the Civil War. They rejected that. And it was kind of astonishing that Coolidge would even take the time to campaign down there because it wasn't expected that Republicans were going to win a single Southern state, but they paid off. Coolidge's efforts in the Upper South did pay off slightly in the 1920 election. As we know, in the 1920 election, Harding and Coolidge won in a landslide election over Democrat James Cox and his vice presidential candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would later become president himself. But in that landslide win that ended up getting accomplished, the Republicans surprisingly took a southern state for the first time since the end of Reconstruction. They actually managed to win the state of Tennessee, partly due to, most likely, to Coolidge's campaigning efforts in the Upper South. So that was actually quite the shock that Coolidge's efforts had actually paid off to some degree. And before we go further here, we'll show. I think I have two pictures of it, a couple when he was younger, coming up into his. So this is a picture of Coolidge when he was only about 7 years old. Yeah, unlike some presidents where when you're younger, it's kind of hard to tell that that's somebody. Coolidge is one that he just kind of maintains the same look as he grows up, and you'll see what I mean in some of these later photos. But he just kind of maintains the same look throughout his life. He doesn't change much in the face. But that was him at 7, so this would have been him around the 18. I'm trying to think here. He was born in 1872, so about 1879. Here we have a picture of Coolidge after as a Amherst College graduate in 1895. So this is him right after graduating from Amherst, right when he's about ready to begin his law career that will lead him into the political sphere in a few years. Here is a picture of the childhood home of Calvin Coolidge. It is the Plymouth Notch home of his parents. It is the Calvin Coolidge Historical Site today in Vermont. This was his childhood home, and we're going to come back to this home because this is going to play a role when Coolidge becomes president in 1923. He's actually at this house when he learns that he's become president. So we'll come back to that. But this is the house. It's preserved today that you can go see it up in Vermont, which I believe is the only president to have actually been born in Vermont. And then here we have a picture of his family in 1915 during his time as lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. So we have Calvin Coolidge here in the middle. We have his wife, Grace. Grace was also eccentric a little bit at the time for certain ladies because one very I wouldn't say humorous, but very odd detail would be that during her White House years, she actually had a pet raccoon named Rebecca, and she would actually bring this thing to dinner at times and bring this to social gatherings. And some people I think got pretty freaked out because it was a raccoon. But she actually kept a pet raccoon named Rebecca that she was not afraid to carry around with her. And then we have their two sons that they had together. So the one over here, this is John Coolidge. This was the eldest. This was the one that lived until the year 2000. And then over here we have the youngest son, Calvin Coolidge Jr., who ended up dying in the White House due to blood poisoning that ended up severely affecting both of his parents. Now, going into the Harding administration, as we know, Harding and Coolidge take office March 4th of 1921 after the departing Wilson administration is gone. Coolidge was relatively not a major figure in the Harding administration. He was not often seen. As we know, up to this point, vice presidents are not expected to have a whole lot of duties. They're pretty much their only constitutional duty, like delegated to them by the Constitution, like actively, is to be president of the Senate, but they can only vote in the event of a tie. And other than that, we know that obviously when the president dies or is incapacitated, the vice president is expected to take over. That had become solidified at that point. But other than that, the vice presidency isn't the most adventurous job in the world. So Coolidge didn't have a really major profile figure in the in the Harding administration. It wasn't something that he really had a high profile in. A lot of people kind of forgot about Coolidge at times as stuff went on because he's just not there. Now, he did pick up during those years, he picked up the nickname of Silent Cow. And Silent Cow was a nickname that Coolidge picked up because of his habit of not really saying a whole lot of words. He was not a very talkative person, especially in public events or at state dinners, which he would end up attending. One of the it's debated whether or not the story is true, but one story that comes about from at the time period of him being vice president was that there was a state dinner going on, and Coolidge ends up sitting next to this woman at the state dinner who kind of, comes next to him and kind of mentions to him, I have a bet with a friend that I can make you say more than two words tonight. And Coolidge, according to the story, kind of looks at her in response and gives her this response, and it's the only words he gives her all night. You lose. It doesn't speak again. Now, Coolidge himself debated that that had never actually happened, but it's a common story that is associated with Coolidge, and it does kind of fit the. I mean, I'm not saying it did happen, but it does kind of put forward why we called him Silent Cow. He was not a man of very many words at all, and that is a nickname that stuck with him throughout the rest of his life. Now, Harding did happen to invite Coolidge during his time in office. He did invite Coolidge to attend regular cabinet meetings, which was actually a first for a president to do so. Usually, the vice president was not a regular attendee at presidential cabinet meetings, and Harding kind of makes that turnaround and kind of invites Coolidge and say, "Hey, you're vice president. You should probably be sitting in on these too, because I mean, what if something were to happen to me, or something were to go on? You need to be just informed as I am, instead of just getting all the information from me." So that habit of the vice president attending presidential cabinet meetings, now that is continued to today. The vice president is usually attending these cabinet meetings, but back in the day, that was not a common thing, and at times that was not exactly didn't really work out well because then you had the instance of a president dying or being killed, and then the vice president comes in and knows almost nothing. And that wasn't always the best thing. So the modern practice of that occurring where the vice president attends cabinet meetings on the regular, that starts during the Harding administration, and Coolidge is the one that ends up being the first vice president to do so on the regular. Now, as we know, Harding ends up dying in office. He dies on his Western tour of the United States on August 2nd of 1923 of a heart attack in San Francisco. And Coolidge at the time was visiting the family home in Vermont. So, in case we need a refresher, he is at this house when Harding dies. He is visiting the family home. He's vice president. He don't have much to do. So you would think, oh, he's gonna know right away. Well, that doesn't happen. It isn't until the night of August 2nd that he ends up kind of getting the news in the early morning of August 3rd because Coolidge's family home did not have electricity yet. It didn't have even a telephone, and thus the only way to kind of contact Coolidge and let him know that, hey, the president is dead, you're president now, was to send up an actual in-person messenger, which the messenger didn't arrive until the early morning, late hours on the night of August 2nd, August 3rd. And that was when they had to wake up Coolidge and his family at the house and say, hey, the president's dead. Like, you're president now. You have to return to Washington. And Coolidge ended up getting dressed, and at 2:47 a.m., he came downstairs to greet the assembled reporters who had kind of come to the front of the house. And then his dad, who was a notary public, was able to actually grab the family Bible and administer the oath of office to his son at about two, almost 3 in the morning on August 3rd. And then for light, they used a kerosene lamp. It kinda looked like something out of the 19th century, not in the modern day world. And then after his dad had administered the oath of office, Coolidge, of course, said brief remarks to the reporters, and then him and his family went back to bed. It was a very uneventful swearing in, just a little odd in its thing. Now, Coolidge would end up leaving his family home the very next day. So, come the morning of August 3rd, he's on his way back to Washington to assume the office of the presidency. When he did get back in Washington, there was questions over whether or not the swearing in by his dad was official, whether or not it had been an official act. It was, given his dad was a notary public, he was a government official. He had every bit of authority to actually administer the oath of office. But just to settle any rumors that the first swearing in had been unofficial, they did end up having the Chief Justice actually swearing in a second little small private swearing in ceremony when he got back to the White House, just to lay to rest any questions of it being, not official. So Coolidge, so now we come to Calvin Coolidge's presidency. He is going to inherit the rest of Harding's term, and he's also going to end up getting a term of his own. So Coolidge, when he inherits the presidency from Harding, he is left with an administration that right now is in the rife of scandal. Scandals are starting to come to light that have been occurring within the Harding administration. Harding, fortunately for him, had ended up kind of passing away before a lot of these scandals came into the public eye, but just as they were emerging. Had he been alive further, it probably would have been a lot worse for him in his public reception. But Coolidge, he comes in, inherits this administration. And now he's dealt with all these scandalous cabinet officials who have been conducting, illegal acts behind Harding's back. And out of respect for Harding, Coolidge had largely kept his cabinet, as he didn't think he had any authority to do so to remove any cabinet members and get his own cabinet until he began his own term, if he wanted to do that. At the time, we have scandals like, most notably, the Teapot Dome scandal involving Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, who had kind of embezzled money and took bribes in order to sell away federal nature reserves and stuff for the development of oil and other things like that. And Coolidge, at first, he doesn't want to fire anybody because there's been no trial, there's been no investigation, there's been no conclusion that any of these men are actually guilty in a court of law. It's all conjecture, and he kind of argues, I'm not doing a thing until it's been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. You must presume a man's innocence in this country until they have been proven guilty. So Coolidge at first does not move against these scandalous cabinet members. Once the court proceedings go through and the investigations do conclude that this did occur, Coolidge then asked many of them to resign, and for those that refused to resign, like Albert Fall, I believe he actually had to fire because he tried to refuse resigning his position, and Coolidge was like, "Okay, guess what? You're fired. It's problem solved." So he does very quickly try to help out with these scandal investigations in order to try to restore some integrity to the White House that had seemingly been going out at the end of the Harding administration with all these scandals. In December of 1923, Coolidge would address a special session of Congress. During his first speech to an assembled joint body of Congress, he would state that he supported a majority of Harding's policies, and it would also be the first presidential speech to ever be broadcast over radio, which was a first. So that's happened in December of 1923. I believe it was December 6th. In May of 1924, Coolidge would end up vetoing a World War I veteran bonus bill. It would end up getting overridden by Congress anyway and still go into effect, but Coolidge had argued for his veto. Why? For his veto, at least, he argued that, I'm not signing this bill because I am a champion of limited government. I am a champion of, private enterprise. I don't think the government should be handing out more money to veterans. Not that I don't thank the veterans for their service every day, but for the factor that I don't think the federal government needs to be, throwing out more taxpayer dollars. And I think the World War I veterans bill was probably the wrong thing for him to veto. I mean, these were the World War I veterans. Up to that point, these were America's war veterans that had just fought a war for the preservation of democracy, had gone over to Europe, gone over to the trenches. They should have got a bonus on their pensions, and they weren't going to get that if Congress had not overridden that bill, that overridden the veto that Coolidge put on it. Coolidge, later in 1924, he would also pass the Immigration Act later that year that would seek to restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the early 1920s is going to start seeing a drastic change in the United States policy toward immigration. Prior to the 1920s, prior to the Harding and Coolidge administrations, the United States was almost like this beacon for immigrants from Europe and elsewhere. It was like this open beacon for immigrants to come. There's you can achieve the American dream over here. We don't care what your nationality is. We don't care where you come from. We don't care how poor you are. Anybody can make it here in America. And going up from the late 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, there is literally millions of immigrants a year coming into the United States to make a new life for themselves. I mean, that was a main driver of a lot of the shipping trade that was occurring at that time, especially in the 1910s, like around the time that we have, the Titanic disaster and other shipping lines. They're making a lot of money, not just off these rich business people that are going across the ocean, but they're making a lot of money off of the immigrants who are willing to pay for passage across the Atlantic to get over to the United States and immigrate there. Now, when the 1920s comes up, this attitude changes very drastically. The United States, a lot of the leading conservative Republican politicians did not want further immigration. They thought that immigrants were stealing jobs. They kind of make a lot of the same arguments today, if you really think about it. Much hasn't changed in 100 years. But they argued, that we let in too many. They're stealing American jobs. Some of them are dangerous because they might bring communist ideas. Because, of course, right after the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union's establishment, that's a big fear. And so there's a lot of weariness about allowing immigrants in the 1920s. It's an entirely 180 reversal. And Coolidge signs this act, and it really marks a turning point for immigration law in the United States because where beforehand the United States have been relatively accepting of new immigrants, now they're really restricting how many they're going to take in a year, and they're not broadcasting that America's this big, come to America. They're like, come to America, but we can't guarantee you're getting in. Now, Coolidge would also sign in 1924, he would sign the Revenue Act, which would also go along with his view of limited government. He was a very big believer in tax cuts, especially for the rich, as it was a common notion at the time that believing that if the rich were given tax cuts on their income taxes and otherwise, it would invest more money into the economy and give more money to the middle classes. Did that actually happen? No, that never actually happened. And you can even say that, we still haven't learned our lesson on that because I can bring up this with truth because back in 2017, everyone knows Donald Trump, our current president, he just took office for a second time about a week or two ago. He passed the one tax cut bill that he ended up getting through. I think everyone just calls it the Trump tax cut bill. I don't even remember what the official name is, but everyone just knows it as that. The Trump tax cuts is what we call it, and the idea that Trump had for lowering the tax cuts on people making over, I know it was mostly for the rich, but it was over, I think it was well over $100,000 a year you had to be making even to get the cut. But the idea that he had, of course, was that if we give the tax cut to these rich businessmen and cut down how much they're having to spend in taxes a year, they'll reinvest that money in new jobs, which will create jobs for the American economy and, will help everything. That didn't happen then either. It didn't happen in 1924, and it didn't happen in 2017. Now, in 2017, we know specifically what happened. Those same rich individuals and companies that were given those tax cuts that Trump had hoped was going to reinvest in American jobs simply bought back shares and stock of their own company in order to raise their share prices on the stock market. They didn't really, a lot of them didn't invest in American jobs. Not to say some of them probably did. Some of them may have been generally good and actually done so, but a majority did not. And middle class, they thought they benefited, but in hindsight, they really lost out on that because the rich just kept getting richer. And this is what happened in 1924 as well. And to put it to put it frankly, what did we get at the end of the 1920s as a result of overspending and buying on credit and just limited government interference in the economy? What did we get at the end of the 1920s because of these Republican policies that were adopted then? That's right. We got the Great Depression. The stock market crashed, and America went into the worst economic depression it has ever had in its almost 250-year history. Even to this day, we have never had another financial depression as we had back in the 1930s, late 1929 into the 1930s. We have not had that repeat. I hope to God we never do. But the same policies that are wanting to be enacted by one party today It scares me as a historian because I'm thinking back to the 1920s where they're kind of a lot very similar or mirror-like in some ways, and I'm thinking, "Well, what did that ultimately get us?" That got us into a whole mess of economic trouble. So, I'm just, like, looking back here, and we're making parallels to today to see how Americans have kind of still not learned their lesson in certain respects to certain policies. And Coolidge would even later admit himself that some of his actions during the presidency, like the Revenue Act, cutting those tax rates, may have had he even recognized they had likely played a role in the Great Depression actually starting. He did recognize that after his presidency had left. He wrote that in his memoirs that he believed that he bore some of the responsibility, and he regretted that he had. Another thing that Coolidge was able to get during 1924 in kind of a landmark bill at the time is I'd say a landmark overall considering how they had been treated in the past was he ended up signing the bill that granted citizenship to all Native Americans that had been born in the United States on June 2nd of that year, which gave citizenship to most of all of Native Americans. And this is a picture of Coolidge meeting members of the Osage Nation after he had signed that bill in June of 1924. Considering their treatment in the past, that was a landmark bill. Considering the factor that Native Americans had been, kicked off their land, had been killed, massacred, everything else, that was a landmark bill that finally allowed them, to get their proper legal status within this nation. They should be citizens, and I'm happy they are. They should be. They should have been from the start. Never should have encountered what they had to go through to get there. In 1924, Coolidge would decide to run for his own term, and he faced little opposition within the Republican Party in terms of actually getting the nomination. The slogan for that year's election, for the Republicans at least, was "Keep cool with Coolidge." Basically, why would you want to switch the reins? Coolidge is more than capable of handling his own term. So he's going for a goal that has only ever been accomplished at that point by Theodore Roosevelt, who had come to the office of president after the death of McKinley, and then Roosevelt decided that he wanted to run for his own term. And so far, he had been the only vice president to have ascended to the presidency and then won his own term outright. Coolidge is going to pull off that same feat in 1924. However, there were concerns that we could be facing the situation of 1912, where the Republican vote got split and Democrats won, because there is a Republican senator from Wisconsin at that time, Robert La Follette, who kind of goes out with his own third party, be it with this progressive party, and ends up going into the race himself. And so there is the fear that this is going to repeat again. The Republicans during the 1924 race actually chose Brigadier General Charles G. Dawes. Well, he was a former brigadier general at that point, but they choose Mr. Dawes to be Coolidge's new running mate. That way, the post of vice presidency will be filled, and Coolidge will have a vice president. The Democrats would nominate John Davis of West Virginia. Now, Coolidge would have one problem. His son, Calvin Jr., as we mentioned, he ended up getting blood poisoning. He ended up getting a blister on his foot, and then it had popped in some way or manner. He ended up getting blood poisoning from that and ended up dying during his father's reelection bid. Now, of course, being a grieving father, Coolidge is in no condition to really want to be campaigning. He's in no condition to really want to go out and look like he's happy because he's grieving the loss of his youngest son. And this does impact him for the later half of his reelection campaign. He becomes much more withdrawn, he becomes less enthusiastic, and the people do see that, but I think a lot of people also understood why it had been that way. So Coolidge, as we know, he ends up winning the 1924 election on a very similar level to what Harding and him had accomplished in 1920. The 1924 election results were as follows: that you needed 266 electoral votes to win the presidency. That was a majority back then. And Coolidge ended up getting 382 of them, well over what he ended up needing. His Democratic opponent Davis had 136 votes, and La Follette, the third party candidate, actually got 13 of them. He did win his home state of Wisconsin. So Coolidge took 35 states, Davis took 12, La Follette took 1. The popular vote, Coolidge won 54% of the popular vote, with the remaining popular vote being split between Davis at 28.8% and 16.6% for LaFollette at a third party bid. And just to illustrate that, here we have a couple more pictures. So here is a picture of Coolidge during his time as vice president with President Harding, his and then their two wives together. So Grace is right next to Coolidge, and then you have Florence Harding next to her husband. This would have been before Harding's death, of course. And then here we have just the electoral image of the electoral map results from the 1924 election where Coolidge ended up getting his own term outright. So pretty much a landslide sweep throughout the nation, other than the very reliable Democratic South, which is going to continue that way until about mid 1960s. It does not change until Lyndon B. Johnson comes along, and we'll see why when we get to him one day. And then, of course, Wisconsin ends up going for the third party bid. So, in terms of what Coolidge is going to do with his presidency, he spends a lot of his presidency, as we mentioned, adhering to the idea of small government and private enterprise. Coolidge, at his core, is a conservative. He is not for government intervention. He's very much for the Thomas Jefferson championed economic principle of laissez-faire, hands-off economics, where the government needs to keep its hands out of the economy as much as conveniently possible and allow private enterprise to flourish. He continued his efforts in his own term to basically cut taxes and limit government spending. He would also stack regulatory commissions with officials who were friendly to business and less likely to actually want to interfere. And a common quote that was attributed to Coolidge at the time was the chief business of the American people is business. Mind you, this is what we call the roaring 20s. The United States is doing quite well economically. It's having a post war economic boom after World War One. The 1920s is one of the most prosperous decades for most Americans. However, we all know that at the very end, it all comes to a screeching, crashing halt. And we'll see why with the next president that we cover. So, in terms, we're going to cut over here to foreign policy for a second. And foreign policy is not really something that Coolidge takes a lot of personal responsibility for. He was not well versed in global affairs. Coolidge was more content to kind of leave the whole subject of state affairs in the hands of those in the State Department. He was not the most fluent global affairs guy. And so he really didn't like to take a personal role in a lot of foreign policy decisions unless he absolutely had to. And he was very much also a non-interventionist. He didn't believe in intervening in a lot of stuff. Now, Coolidge considered the Republican victories in 1920 and the 1924 elections to be a rejection of the Wilsonian view of basically the of getting involved in global politics. How Woodrow Wilson had kind of been out there in foreign relations during World War One and trying to forge the peace afterward. Coolidge kind of viewed the two Republican victories right after Wilson's second term had ended as kind of the confirmation that the American people don't want that. The American people want to be isolationists. They endorse the view that we're putting forward. So he maintained the United States' absence from the League of Nations that Harding had already gone to, and Coolidge simply maintains. He still maintains that the United States is not joining the League of Nations that had been Wilson's brainchild, but the United States never actually joined it, which will end up having a major impact on that league, as we know, because with the absence of the United States, the league really loses a lot of its authority. And then when the 1930s come around and the rise of authoritarianism and totalitarianism in Europe and Asia with Japan and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, the league's really just not, they can't really do anything. They can protest, but they can't do anything. And that's going to lead us right into an even worse conflict in about 20 years from Coolidge's presidency. I think we all know what that is. In 1924, so this was before actually the election. Well, not 1924. I believe it was 1925. I'm going to confirm it here. But Okay, it was in 1924. So it was before Dawes had actually become vice president. And in case we need to know, which I think would be correlated here, this is Coolidge and Vice President Dawes. Now, Dawes had been involved with the Coolidge administration before he was put on the Republican vice presidential spot in 1924 with Coolidge. They had worked together prior, and one thing that he had gotten in 1924, a significant significant accomplishment in global affairs that Coolidge really didn't take a lot of credit for because he had put Dawes in charge, was he had appointed Dawes to head the multinational committee that was discussing a renegotiation of Germany's war reparations. Germany, as we know, after losing the First World War, was asked to pay it wasn't even asked, it was demanded that Germany was going to pay massive sums of money in war damages, war reparations to the Allied nations, particularly Belgium and France, who had suffered a lot of the damage from Germany during the First World War. But as we know, Germany's economy after World War One is absolutely in shambles. And in 1923, 1924, the German economy is so bad that it's going through literal hyperinflation. And there's at this time, there's a lot of pictures you can even see it. The money in Germany was so worthless that people were using whole stacks of uh, Reichsmark bill notes, banknotes, as like building blocks for children to make forts out of. It was that worthless. To even buy a whole wheelbarrow full of Reichsmark notes couldn't even buy you a loaf of bread. It was that bad. And Germany is in utter economic problems and economic shambles. And as if their money's so worthless, not only are their people suffering, but the German government is also telling the world, we can't afford to make these war reparations payment. Our money's like worthless right now. So what do you want us to do? And of course, some of the other allies are war hawkish, particularly Belgium and France, and saying, well, you're going to pay it anyway, or we're going to occupy certain things. So there's a looming international crisis if this is not addressed. And Coolidge appoints Dawes to kind of be the head of the American delegation to this committee. And Dawes would end up helping to craft what is called the Dawes Plan of 1924. It would allow for fixed annual amounts for German reparation payments to be paid to the Allies, and in order to help Germany's economy out, it would also authorize a large loan from American banks in order to stabilize and stimulate the German economy so that they could actually try to recover and be able to make those payments. Now, Coolidge, during his presidency, he would also refuse to extend recognition to the Soviet Union, much like Harding had done before him. The Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, during his own term of office, was partly crafted by Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, and it would actually denounce war as an instrument of national policy. All of the signing nations, particularly the United States and Great Britain, had kind of denounced that, yeah, we're not going to use war to make international change. Did that hold up? No. It was an attempt to actually outlaw war. Did it work? Heck no. But it was a fine notion that it was attempted. Okay, got that. So then we have possibly two of the worst things of Harding's administration, two of the things that he's not really remembered real fondly for. And one of them dealt with farming, the other dealt with floods. The floods was the more minor of the two, I think. The Mississippi River had major floods in 1927, which up until 2005 had actually been the worst natural disaster ever experienced by states and communities along the Gulf Coast until Hurricane Katrina came around. Now, Coolidge opposed flood measures that were going to be put forward as a possible solution to controlling future floods of the Mississippi River, as he argued that he did not want federal government spending money on flood control measures. He argued that if you want the control measures so badly, the local community should be paying for them, which of course was nearly impossible. So Coolidge is not for flood control measures. He didn't even visit the affected areas like a modern president typically does after there's been a natural disaster because he viewed that basically it would be simply seen as political grandstanding. It wasn't really going to do anything if he actually went to go and visit these areas. He did end up signing a compromise bill in May of 1928 that was passed by Congress in order to provide funding for those flood control measures, but at much less funding that had originally been proposed. And Coolidge was willing to do it then, but he wasn't a real big supporter of that. And that was kind of criticized at the time. Is the president really helping the people? Is he really standing with the people in their hour of need? That was questioned at the time. The biggest issue of Coolidge's presidency, of which he was vehemently against, came up for relief for American farmers that had come up during the 1920s. In the 1920s, agricultural prices in the United States were constantly off and on, but a lot during most of the decade they were actually falling, which was hurting American farmers trying to sell their product in the market. In 1924, the Agriculture Secretary Henry Wallace favored a bill which would raise prices of crops by having the federal government buy crops and sell abroad at lower prices. Coolidge, of course, it comes out in opposition to this. And then so does Congress later in 1924 because the prices, right when they end up bringing this bill forward to Congress, the agricultural prices spike and they go up. And thus Congress argues, well, there's not really a need for it anymore, so we're going to go ahead and scrap the bill. Prices went up. Well, just a few years later, just 2 years later, in 1926, falling prices again hit the agricultural market, and this leads to the proposed McNary-Haugen Farm Bill. It was named after its two primary authors, State Senator Charles McNary and Representative Gilbert Haugen, both of whom were within Coolidge's own party of the Republicans. They proposed that the government would buy surplus crops in high yield years and then hold them for later sale or abroad to help farmers make money during those hard years when prices were low and they had a vast surplus they needed to sell. Now, Coolidge opposed the bill when it came about. He opposed the McNary-Haugen bill, favoring instead increasing profitability by modernizing agricultural practices, which was going to cost perhaps just as much money as the first bill, but he was not in favor of the first at all. Like he came out against that, said nope, flat out veto. He also then had his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, whom he had carried over from the Harding administration, actually publicly denounced the bill as inflationary, that it would do nothing to actually help and relieve farmers. It was just going to cause further inflation, which ended up helping to kill the bill later that year in 1926. Coolidge would then support a new bill called the Curtis-Crisp Act in order to get aid for farmers, which would create a federal board to lend money to farm cooperatives in times of surplus. This bill did not pass Congress, and it did not even get to the president's desk. The McNary-Haugen bill was then reintroduced the following year in February of 1927 and narrowly passed Congress this time. Coolidge would veto that bill and state that it would only add to federal bureaucracy and beneficial to exporters, that it was not going to help farmers, reiterating his statement from the last time around. Congress did not override his veto. The bill was then reintroduced and passed again for a final time in 1928 as further agricultural price falls began to occur. And once again, Coolidge vetoed it, arguing in the statement that he gave for it, despite the fact that he himself had been the son of a farmer, stated the following statement: "Farmers never made much money. I do not believe we can do much about it." That is not exactly the words I think you want to hear from your president at the time that you consider yourself to be an American farmer and you're struggling. I don't think you'd want to be hearing that. Coolidge ended up in the long run not deciding to run in 1928, even though he very well probably could have. He decided out of his own convictions he did not want to. The death of his son and many of the other orders had kind of just taken the life out of him during his presidency. He really did not have any intention of running for another term. Instead, his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, was selected by the Republicans to be their nominee in the 1920 presidential election, of which Hoover would actually go on to win and become the next president. Coolidge would leave office on March 4th of 1929 and retired to Northampton, Massachusetts. This is a picture we have of Coolidge with his cabinet during his presidency. And right next to him, we have Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon, who kind of came out with him against the farm relief bills that were proposed. And then back here, we have Herbert Hoover, his Secretary of Commerce, who would end up becoming his successor in the office of president. Hoover is going to end up winning the presidential election in 1928. During his post presidency, Coolidge would write many memoirs and magazine commentaries as was requested by him. was requested of him. The Great Depression, as we mentioned, began very shortly after he left office. Coolidge left office in March of 1929, and the Great Depression starts that October with the stock market crash. And Coolidge would recognize that many of his policies may have bore some responsibility for for the stock market crash and the onset of the Great Depression. As he said to many friends, he reportedly had said to them that he had avoided the big problems as president. He had not addressed them as he should have, or as I believe one biographer had actually written of Coolidge, a quote that he had given the biographer when doing it was he had wrote that he was a Puritan in Babylon, that Washington was this corrupt city, and he had come in as this Puritan thinking that he was going to get it changed overnight. Coolidge ended up dying pretty early into his retirement. He died at the age of 60 of a heart attack himself on January 5th, 1933. When Hoover ran for re-election in 1932, he tried Coolidge did come out in support of Hoover. He did come out and try to support him for his presidential bid, but Hoover ended up losing re-election, of course, to FDR, which we'll get to in March. So Coolidge ends up dying, as we mentioned, pretty early. He was only 60 years old when he ended up dying, January 5th of 1933. So that concludes for Mr. Coolidge, Mr. Violent Cow, concludes for him. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, any added information or anything like that, feel free to put it in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to look through them when I can. As for next week, I don't know what video we're gonna hit first for the month of February, but I'm sure we'll figure that out in due time. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week going into the weekend, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video.